years as a PDC site, and really importantly, our 4th year with our partners at Stanford, which has really enriched our PDC's effectiveness in coaching startups by tapping into Stanford's world-famous biodesign program. I mean, Stanford really is like the world's leader in many aspects of startups and biodesign and all the things that they've integrated into that program. Really, this topic of real-world evidence and data is really a very important one, and it's a timely one. This was an entirely new concept for us 4 years ago when the FDA tasked the PDCs with real-world evidence demonstration projects. But I have to say, as I've learned more about it over the years, it makes so much more sense now. Big data has really been the frontier for medicine for the last several years with the implementation of electronic health and medical records. They've become digitized. There's ways to access these. Really, medicine was really behind the rest of the world in terms of having access to data, but we're catching up. And the real world data that's already out there, but it's not specifically crafted for the purposes of a clinical trial, has really tremendous potential to have a complete and accurate picture of reality, more than looking at the smaller amount of data that's only functioning during clinical trials. And as a pediatric surgeon, as somebody who's really out there in the real world doing surgery and taking care of patients, I just see an enormous amount of potential. When I talk to my colleagues around the country, they all do, and we're extremely excited to share this program with you today. I'd also really like to thank our program officers, Erica and Vasum, for spearheading this program and effort, along with all the other pediatric device consortium programs who provided great input on today's program. I'd also like to thank Juan Espinoza for his technical support, along with our terrific team at UCSF and Stanford, Usha, Vinith, and Samir in particular, in all of today's presentations. Thanks to everyone for attending, and let's get started. And I'd really also like to introduce and thank Liz Gress and Stefano Rensi, who are our leaders here in the area of real-world evidence, and who are going to go over the overview and goals for this 4th Innovators Forum. So thank you, and welcome to everybody.
Thank you for the introduction, Hanmin, and thank you to everybody out there for showing up to our forum. So we're living in the age of information, and an increasing number of our interactions with the healthcare system are mediated by computers, such that our actions in the space create a digital record of their performance. Now, these records are being collected and stored in massive data warehouses, and in aggregate, they provide a massive trove of observational data, real-world data that we can learn from. These new data streams present a number of opportunities and challenges for stakeholders, in particular, special populations like pediatric patients. And we're going to touch on some of those opportunities and challenges here today. Now, one of the best opportunities that we have to use data to accelerate innovation in pediatric medical devices is in regulatory decision-making. Generating the evidence to support a regulatory decision is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, barrier to bringing new technologies into the clinic. Because real-world data are collected outside of clinical trials, they can often be obtained relatively easily and inexpensively. And they also capture information about performance and outcomes in clinical care settings. Careful analysis of this data can yield robust and reliable real-world evidence of safety and effectiveness, and its use in regulatory applications can reduce the burden and improve the rigor of decisions. Can we advance forward 2 slides, please? However, there are many challenges that we will have to address. There are technical challenges, such as building the infrastructure to support large-scale studies, developing ways to assure the quality and integrity of the data, and also accounting for some of the biases that arise from collection outside of a randomized controlled setting. We will also have to reimagine certain concepts of respect, beneficence, and justice that might apply when we're analyzing this data that's collected in this digital world that we live in now. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to turn this over to Liz Gress. Next slide. Yes, there you go.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Stefano. So why should pediatric device developers care about real-world data and real-world evidence? It's a source of evidence that can support your regulatory applications, reimbursement and coverage decisions, and more. Sources of real-world data are all around us and include claims data, connected devices, electronic health records, and patient and product registries. To ground it in an example, which you'll hear more about on our panel, our PDC worked with AtriCure to conduct a real-world evidence study supporting evidence generation for their cryo-ice cryoablation probe to adolescent patients undergoing chest wall surgery. Cryo-ice probes, whose label was silent with regards to patient age, have been identified as a new mode of pain management for pectus excavatum surgery, and a handful of surgeons around the country were using it off-label for this application with great results. But AtriCure could not promote or train surgeons in this technique because their label did not explicitly extend to children. We designed a retrospective electronic health record study to collect instances of off-label use at UCSF and use this to expand the evidence base for FDA review. This avoided AtriCure having to conduct an expensive, time-consuming randomized controlled trial in children. So the goals of today's program are: 1, to shed light on the basics of real-world evidence. What is it? Why is it useful? And how can you use it? 2, to share experiences and examples of real-world evidence in use in the real world. And 3, to discuss with key stakeholders in the field, including the FDA, medical device startups, academic researchers, and clinicians, about current challenges with using real-world evidence and ideas to move the field forward.
Well, thanks, Liz and Stefano. That was great. Now we get to hear from the FDA, and we're fortunate to have Felipe Aguel, who is the Deputy Director, the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis. And he has experience both in the FDA and in the real world. For instance, he has been at work in the company that Liz mentioned, Aguel. Felipe?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to address this audience today. I do want to mention that although I have worked for AtriCure in the past, I am no longer associated with them, and I'll be sharing FDA's perspective, but we'll leave it to AtriCure folks to talk about their experience and thoughts regarding the particular test case. So let me start by sharing my screen. Okay. As Dr. Harrison mentioned, I'm the one deputy director in the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis in the Center for Devices. Among other things, we are responsible for fostering the use of real-world evidence in decision-making and provide consults to the OHTs, the offices that conduct pre-market reviews to clear or approve devices. So some of the stuff that you'll see at the beginning of my talk has already been covered, so I'll go through it pretty quickly in the interest of time. As mentioned earlier, the real world data are data related to patient health status or the delivery of healthcare, which is routinely collected from various sources, which Liz and Stefano have covered quite nicely. The question is how to convert that data into usable information or into real world evidence. Real world evidence is the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from the analysis of that real world data. So you can think of it as real world data is what's been collected. Once it has been analyzed and synthesized, then you can use the real world evidence for regulatory decision making and many other purposes as well. It can be used throughout the total product life cycle. Unlike drugs, we think of devices as a continuum where going from innovation to prototype to clinical use, market release to most post-market experience, then that experience is then fed back into innovation and iteration on a device. And there are multiple places in this cycle where real-world evidence can really have an impact, from using it for hypothesis generation, informing trial designs. Real-world evidence can be used as a control arm for a clinical trial when a randomized control trial may not be feasible. It can also be used as a platform to support a clinical trial. Even a randomized clinical trial can be done within the context of real-world evidence platform. Can be used for post-market evidence generation, such as post-approval study or other mandated studies, used for public health surveillance. And I think what many people are interested in using real-world evidence for, from a regulatory perspective, is to generate that evidence to support expansion of indications, as Liz alluded to earlier, will be talked about later in the program, where a device may have been cleared for marketing or approved via PMA for one use. The physicians and healthcare providers can choose to use that device either according to the label or for other purposes, and collecting that information from different sources, such as claims or electronic health records, is something that would be really a shame not to harness that existing data to support regulatory decision-making for that particular use. However, it is important that the data, as Stefano alluded to earlier, is highly reliable. There's high fidelity between that data source and what actually happened to those patients that are being quote unquote followed in a real world evidence study. And things like missing data and being able to ascertain device exposure, how a device was used from the records, are all going to be important criteria to consider in determining whether the data will serve a regulatory purpose to expand an indication. So the key criteria that are laid out in a guidance document published by the agency in 2017 are the data's relevance, things like do we know that the device in question was used? Are the relevant endpoints and duration of endpoints to establish its safety and or effectiveness included in the data? Can they be ascertained from the data's reliability, missingness, ensuring that there is that fidelity as the data is transformed from raw medical records to a form that can be analyzed. And finally, patient protections, including patient confidentiality, is something that needs to be taken into account. These topics are all mentioned and described in the guidance document that you see pictured here. I do want to take a little time to talk about a publication that the center put out back in March or April of this year that included 90 examples of regulatory decisions that were based on real-world evidence. Now, this was not an all-inclusive list. It included decisions made dating back to 2012 through 2019. It was not a statistical sampling. It was a way to publish and have a single place where manufacturers and our reviewers and all stakeholders could go to read about examples where real-world evidence was successfully used for regulatory decision-making, drawing from publicly available information. This was accompanied by an FDA Voices blog from Dr. Shurin and Dr. Caños, which highlighted the value and then the spectrum of the real-world evidence examples included in this publication. And importantly, every single one of our OHTs, or Offices of Health Technology, were represented in the publication. Our office is divided along 6 clinical specialties, plus in vitro diagnostics is the 7th, and there were examples from each of those. What were we trying to achieve by publishing these examples? One, show our commitment to advancing evidence generation with highly relevant and reliable real-world data across the total product life cycle for timely regulatory decision-making, showcase concrete examples, real-world examples of real-world evidence use. They can be made, they have been made, and the regulatory bar has been met in the past and will continue to be met. We expect the use of real-world evidence in submissions to only increase going forward. And finally, we wanted to showcase a multidimensional diversity of the use across clinical specialties, our Offices of Health Technology, submission types, stage in the total product life cycle, the data sources. Not all of these examples are registries, and the role of the real-world evidence in the decisions made. So let me highlight a little bit some of this multidimensional diversity in the examples. So here you can see that there were examples selected that were PMA or Class 3, or highest risk devices, but the examples were not limited to that. The examples included a significant number of HDEs, our humanitarian device exemption for small patient populations, as well as Class 2 devices, as illustrated here with the number of de novo applications and 510K pre-market notifications that were included in the examples. There was great diversity in the primary data source used in the examples that were selected. As I said, yes, there are plenty of registries that were used as a source for the real-world evidence, but also included things like administrative claims data, annotated biospecimens, device-generated data, medical records, sequencing information and patient-generated data. And finally, the way the data was used includes a good breadth of uses, including label expansion and modification and seeking new indications, as the example, the AtriCure example that was mentioned earlier today, as well as how it was used. This was the real world evidence used in these examples weren't supplementary or secondary adjunct data. In many cases, in the majority of cases, they were considered the primary source of clinical information to make the decision, or the sole source of clinical information used to make the decision. Finally, I want to highlight a handful of examples that should hopefully be of great interest to the audience today. Within the publication, we included 3 examples that involved expansion of indications to include pediatric patients. Similar to the AtriCure example that Liz mentioned earlier, the AtriCure example is not one of them because of the time period that was covered in this publication did not include the year in which the AtriCure device was cleared for pediatric use. There were also 2 examples of real-world data leveraged to supplement trial data of in vitro diagnostic used in neonates. And then beyond those 5 examples, there were plenty of examples using patient or device-generated data and included 1 clinical trial embedded within a registry. So with that, I just want to summarize that FDA has and will continue to foster the use of relevant and reliable real-world evidence for regulatory decisions. The use of real-world evidence to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of devices to support their use in pediatric patients is a good example of pre-market use of real-world evidence for regulatory decision-making. And by what I mean there is that there are plenty of instances where a device designed and intended for adult use are being used in pediatric populations, many times off-label, and those uses are being recorded in one way or another in the real world, whether in the claims data, the administrative health data, there may be registries or medical records that can be harnessed to ascertain the safety and effectiveness of the device in the pediatric population, and if done correctly, can certainly be used to support a label expansion for use in pediatrics. It's important to remember that FDA expects that the real-world evidence is relevant for the regulatory question being answered in the study, and that the real-world data upon which it is based is reliable and of high quality. So with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Harrison. Thank you.
And head James Wall, who's the director of the UCSF-Stanford PDC and a driving force. James?
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. So I'm going to ask our other panelists to join us here, Nancy, Christian, and Brandon, and turn on your video, please. So we're really excited to bring you the perspective of real-world evidence from what I would call the front lines. I think we all know it is really hard to develop a new health technology. It takes a decade or more for a health technology to go from idea to widespread adoption. And as an industry, we have so many stakeholders whom we have to convince along the way to get something to patients. Each stakeholder has their own idea of what's valuable. And in theory, real world evidence is a way for us as an industry to create efficiencies. And those efficiencies are critical because the reality is much of the early stage capital that used to invest in health technologies has moved to other industries where development simply happens faster and offers better returns. So to drive innovation, we really, really need efficiencies. We see the potential value of real world evidence, but the purpose of this panel was to really take it to the front lines and talk to people who are thinking about it from that innovators, that startup perspective. How can you actually use it to drive value within your company, and how can you use it to drive efficiencies to get your product to patients? So with that, I am very excited to introduce the panel. We have Nancy Yu from AllStripes. We have Brandon Dottin-Haley from Sonavi Labs, and we have Christian Howell from Aetion. So we're going to start with Nancy. If you could start with giving us a 3 to 5 minute overview of AllStripes, and then we'll move on to Brandon and finish with Christian.
Great. Thanks, James, and thanks, everyone. Excited to be here. So I'm Nancy Yu. I'm the co-founder and CEO of AllStripes. Before this, was head of corporate development at 23andMe, setting up our whole drug R&D division. And then before that, spent some time on Wall Street in biotech and started my career as a genetics researcher in neuroscience. So we started AllStripes about 3 years ago to focus on rare disease. Just the mission is to unlock new treatments for people with rare. So we aren't focused on device primarily, but we're focused on life sciences and real world evidence within rare pediatric conditions and broader rare diseases. So where the challenges we see are, you have a lot of science hitting the market and a lot of companies starting within biotech. But they're all hitting a wall in early clinical development, preclinical, and along that whole life cycle because it's hard to find patients, identify patients, and it's hard to understand what this disease actually entails. What is that natural history? What does progression look like? What are the dynamics of this market? Where are patients? And so our platform is a two-sided platform. One side serves patients directly. So we have a patient-facing product. It's a very consumer-like experience. We have a brand. We work with advocacy groups and beyond. Patients sign up to our platform, give us their permission to go retrieve all their medical records longitudinally since birth, 10 years pre-diagnosis, from all their different facilities that they visited. They give us consent to then use that information for broader research with third-party companies like biopharma and academic researchers. And then we do the hard work behind the scenes of looking into the notes, this complete longitudinal data set, and use NLP and humans in the loop to structure all this data to then serve to life sciences. So the second part of our platform serves life sciences and academic researchers that wish to access this kind of data in a de-identified and pre-consented format. And they're using this information, companies like Novartis, UCB, Ultragenyx, Taysha, companies that are working in these pediatric conditions and beyond to design trials, use this data as potential comparator arms for natural history for their trials. But then even beyond that, just really understanding market development, where patients are, even burden of disease use cases. And I guess the last thing I'll mention is the last conversation really resonated with me because we recently spoke at Duke Margolis and meeting with the FDA and teams at CEDAR and real world evidence and OMP around our platform and where are the challenges of rare, right? And the two key challenges really are that reliability, relevancy, and then we have certainly talked a lot about patient privacy. So on the reliability piece, in my mind, it's really part of it's table stakes, right? Part of it is this GCP compliant? Is it Part 11 compliant? Do you have the longitudinality so that you can actually see all the encounters that patients go through? Can you supplement that with patient-reported information to fill in the gaps? As we know, data in rare is not always very complete. And then on the relevancy side, what we do is we work with our customers in biopharma to understand what is it that they're trying to claim, right? What is their study plan? What are their claims that they're trying to make? And we work with their clinical teams, their chief medical officer, to understand that, so that we're looking in the data that we're structuring for that precise information so that it is relevant to support the claims. And I think our customers are getting input from the FDA in their pre-IND conversations to be able to guide some of this direction. And then, of course, in rare and pediatric conditions in particular, there's a lot of input from both the patients and families, as well as the key opinion leaders and PIs in this space, to really bring together what is that relevancy piece. So excited to be here, excited to chat more.
Awesome. Thanks, Nancy. Brandon, do you want to share from the front line of developing a device? Let us know what you're up to.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Brandon Dottin-Haley, the Chief Business Development Officer for Sonavi Labs. Sonavi Labs is a medical device and software company that is harnessing the most advanced acoustics and rooting all of our solutions in AI to support physicians of all skill levels on the front line, as well as providing telehealth and remote monitoring solutions for patients with chronic diseases. We are focused on respiratory diseases. Our technology is actually a result of several years of research from Johns Hopkins in response to a Gates Foundation challenge to reduce pediatric mortality as a result of pneumonia. So when we think about real world evidence, we actually started by trying to solve a real world problem in developing our technology and then forming the company to commercialize it. So the Felix technology, which we are preparing to launch, is a complete system that includes handheld digital devices that are able to listen to body sounds and determine whether or not there are abnormalities present in near real time. In just under 10 seconds, the device can listen to a patient's lungs and specifically a pediatric patient and determine whether or not they have pneumonia with a 91% accuracy. And so our goal is to continue using real world data that is and evidence that is collected on our devices and annotated through the physician networks that we have and other clinical partners to enhance the software that we have deployed on the Felix hardware to be able to detect and monitor more respiratory conditions like asthma and COPD. But we also continue to use real world evidence as we work to change the way that healthcare is practiced. As you can imagine, telehealth is a very novel solution. And so we're trying to get payers and other health systems to understand the impact that using telehealth solutions can have on improving patient outcomes, as well as reducing bottom line impact. So our goal is to continue to deploy, again, real world evidence in the development of our technology, but also in our commercialization strategy as we seek to launch partnerships with payers and health systems to deploy our solution for remote patient monitoring. And that is kind of where we are right now. And I look forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Christian?
Yeah, and one thanks. I wanted to thank the entire group for today's panel. I'm a bit covetous of Brandon's background. Now that I see us kind of side by side, mine looks enormously or incredibly boring. So I am the Vice President and General Manager of the Medical Device and Diagnostics Group at Aetion. So Aetion is a healthcare analytics company that, and I'm not sure we could have a more appropriate discussion that focuses on converting real world data to real world evidence. So we were started out of the Department of Pharmacoepidemiology at Harvard by Sebastian Schenice and his colleague Jeremy Rassin. The FDA kept going to them, asking them if they could take what they were seeing in clinical trial and replicate it in the real world data. Jeremy had a background in computer science and said if we could build a robust rapid cycle analytics platform, we could probably do this at scale. So started to build out the solution, began working with the FDA. I'm sure many of you have seen some of the work that's been done recently, certainly around some of the COVID vaccine and protocols, really working in biopharma and then working with payers. And what we found is that the Aetion platform really provided two major differentiators. One was how scientifically valid the process and methodologies were. That they were transparent, that they were easily shared. And then second was our sort of disposition toward data. We think of ourselves as data agnostic, but certainly data opinionated and very data fluent. So we can ingest any data source into the platform, but our fidelity is to make sure that that data is fit for purpose. And then it was about a year ago that Scott Gottlieb, who's on our board of directors, and Amy Abernathy from the FDA really encouraged our CEO to lean into medical devices, diagnostics, and digital therapeutics. And so I had spent about 20 years of my career at Medtronic. My last role was leading value-based healthcare and strategic partnerships, and saw firsthand how important data was going to be into the decision-making of providers, and got connected through NEA to Carolyn McGill, our CEO, and had the opportunity to start the medical device and diagnostics group here at Aetion. We're working kind of along the product life cycle with medical device companies. We're helping kind of in the market access side as we think about disease prevalence and standards of care, and we're helping in the regulatory work. It's great to see Felipe on this call. And then we're also seeing a great deal of work downstream as startups and other companies are thinking about commercialization strategies and how they can better stratify cohorts and work with payers and other organizations to make sure that they're getting their intervention to the right patient at the right time. And we do that. Aetion, really, I think of Aetion as kind of having two sides. The first side is a very robust team of data scientists, epidemiologists, biostatisticians that help with real world evidence strategy, data landscaping, clinical and regulatory and payer strategies. And then obviously the engine side, which is the AEP, the Aetion Evidence Platform, which is a robust analytics platform that allows us to generate evidence at scale quite rapidly. So, and we like to think of it as being regulatory grade. So really excited for the discussion. Thanks for including me, James.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think, let's take this kind of through the product life cycle. And let's start, Nancy, with you. And you kind of touched on data relevancy. You have clients on the back end who are very early in exploration. How do you have that conversation with them? And how early should a potential innovator, whether it be biopharma or devices, as someone's looking to innovate in a space, when should they be having that conversation with you on data relevancy and setting themselves up for success?
Yeah, I mean, as we all know, the earlier the better, right? But before you get your protocols for your trials set in stone. So we're often working with our partners from day one, preclinical, pre-IND, when they're trying to do market development, understand that at the highest level, but then also really understand what is their clinical development strategy. And so in these rare conditions, the challenge is you don't have data that's freely available. There's not many KOLs who can really be, give you a lot of data to support some of that trial design, but I think it's a great start. And so from there, we're helping them gather this data that is from this reliable data source where you can audit trail source back to the source document. And that way it can already initiate some of the initial pre-IND conversations with some real information.
And is there even a stage before that you're alluding to where we're really even kind of market discovery and honing value proposition? Are people coming to you with that, even before they're sort of deciding we're going to work on X molecule or X, they're really looking for population information that can inform, frankly, their ability to go raise funds and be investable?
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to pick indications, right? If you have this gene therapy platform, what can it target? And that's often where they're limited is, well, we just don't know what the feasibility of some kind of clinical protocol here is. And so that's the work that we do with the patient advocacy groups that are very motivated and engaged in that very early stage, even pre-development. And so that is the continuum, working with advocacy KOLs to develop that and create almost this menu for what's available, what's feasible for your specific approach.
Very cool. Brandon, I'd love to hear from you, as you're more device specific, you all not only have a device, but you're sort of a digitally native device, right? Not sort of, you are digitally native. You're able to capture essentially every piece of clinical input that comes through the device. So how do you think about gathering and organizing your data for both? Maybe start with talking about regulatory, but then I also want to talk about payment, which is, the end of the spectrum, or not the end, but one of the most important, later stage things in device and pharma is getting paid. So let me hear how you're thinking about using your data to get through both the regulatory and payment challenges that we face.
Absolutely. I think for us, we really tried to be as strategic as possible when thinking about how we design the clinical studies and the pilots that will ultimately get us to reimbursement, which is our goal. We are being very conscious about our resources and trying to think about ways that we could also create some overlap between the types of studies that we're doing. So an example would be using NIH. We have an NIH study going right now that is evaluating the impact of our device in underrepresented communities, specifically looking at asthma. And we know through the first phase of that study that we would need to make some additional changes to the hardware design just to make it a little bit more user friendly. And we're using evidence that we collected in that first study to support an additional pilot that we have planned with Children's National Hospital coming up. And so the goal is to use the evidence from that first study to support the addition, like the enhancement of our technology, but also the design of additional follow-on studies that will help to collect more evidence for us to support the claims that we're making that our technology can improve patient outcomes and reduce the cost of caring for patients in the long term. And so as we're thinking about the that evidence collection and then the type of design, the types of studies that we're designing and the pilots that we're designing, we're trying to be very thoughtful about what those end goals are. So that way on the front end, we can make sure that we're asking the right questions and looking for the right kinds of data.
Fantastic. And how much of this do you rely on consultants outsource? How much is internal, and how has that evolved as the company's grown? Like, where did you look first for help, and how are you kind of bringing it in-house now?
Yeah, it actually has been, we've had a great advisory that has helped us to build this strategy. Leslie Wise, who's our reimbursement advisor, has a wealth of experience with commercialization and securing a reimbursement for medical devices. And so we've really relied a lot on her experience to help us develop our strategy, but are looking at building additional relationships with clinical partners, key opinion leaders around the country, because as we're also developing our technology, we really want to minimize as much data bias as possible. And so when we're thinking about collecting data and deploying it in to patients' homes, especially because we have a significant AI component, we're trying to make sure that we are as thoughtful about how we collect data, where we collect that data, and then how it's deployed into our strategy. So that way we can, again, achieve those goals of reimbursement by proving out the value of our solution when it's deployed in patient homes.
Thank you. So, I think we've certainly seen here at the Stanford Bayer Center for Biodesign that it takes a village to develop new technologies, new molecules. And that village now includes real world evidence. So Christian, I'd like to kind of pass over to you and hear from you. I know you, as the leader of the new medical device unit at Aetion, have been thinking about where you can deliver the most value to early stage, mid stage, late stage companies. So where specifically in the device and technology side, do you see the most value of real world evidence now? And then where do you see it evolving in the future?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that was actually Brandon and Nancy's perspective was really reassuring to know that people are thinking about it that strategically, because what we're finding is real world evidence has the opportunity to be impactful across the product lifecycle, right? Early stage market access, regulatory, even you're talking about HEOR and label expansion, right? So where I'd like to see it occur is way upstream, early stage, as you're doing strat planning and development to say, hey, how are we going to use evidence along the way? Where we're finding it is really in two spots. One is in regulatory submission. So just helping understand faster, easier, less expensive, potentially, but equally as robust evidence generation when we go into the regulatory approval. And then early stage go-to-market commercialization. So how do I think about going to payers? How do I think about using evidence to identify the right cohort of patients where I know my device can be impactful? Though I do think it's important to talk about, certainly in medical devices specifically. So Where evidence can be used, I think is pretty clear, and I think it's going to be used more frequently over the next 10 years. What I do think is the more murky waters is the data question, right? Like what data is fit for purpose? And there's a great example out there. Somebody was talking about this one time as like real world data in medical devices is like 15th century cartography. Like what we know unbelievably well. So if you ask somebody to draw a map of England or London in the 15th century, they could do it down to the street. But you ask them to draw what China and Australia looked like, it was laughably wrong. And the same can be true right now in data, right? Like what we know, registries, we know them really well. What we're learning, EHRs, patient-recorded outcome measures, it is really smart to get the right partner in that, to make sure that you're making wise investments in data, to make sure that you understand that the data is fit for purpose, that the data is going to be aligned to your hypothesis or your research question. Because we've seen company after company after company just, overspend, spend too much time, stay confused in that data space. And then ultimately when they make the submission or they use that data, it's not fit for purpose. So as much as I think the evidence and the use of the evidence is important, I think it's equally important to be very strategic about the way that you're thinking about data.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, because I think that the way that we've thought about developing our, specifically the chronic disease management platform, is how does the patient use the technology over time? What data are we able to collect from that patient over time? And then how is that impacting the provider's ability to provide care for that patient? And so in looking at these kinds of longitudinal studies, our goal is to provide some of that personalized medicine and personalized care that really hasn't existed before through the evidence that we can collect from a patient using our technology every day. In the past, healthcare has really relied on visits in a very kind of spread out and sporadic time frame, and we can now use technology to collect real world evidence and data on patients on a daily basis. And I think to Christian's point, how we use that data to then inform the type of care and the direction that providers take when treating those patients is really important. We are even able to use our technology to understand whether or not a therapeutic is working in real time, just by tracking the trends of those patients over the course of starting a new therapy. And we have publications coming that show how important that could be for pharmaceutical companies. But then as you're again thinking about how these patients are growing and living their lives, that evidence is going to be really impactful.
Yeah, James, it's the one piece of advice I would give to any startup, which is, and Brandon just said it well, don't think about data and evidence episodically, think about it holistically, because it's going to be a part of your company and your technology as you develop across the life cycle. So I think far too many people, because it feels nascent and new, are thinking about it episodically, and it really should be a much more holistic approach.
Yeah, and I love the sort of the tagline out of Andreessen Horowitz of the 363 problem, right? You actually only interact with the healthcare system in its current state 2 days a year. The other 363, we have no idea what's going on. And so the more that we can know what's happening then through smart devices, through collecting, evidence from EHR and patient reported, really the more precise we can be. And I love that, Brandon, in that strategy, you're already thinking about diverse and underserved populations that, you're kind of going to them and getting the data, as opposed to having them come to you where there can be real barriers to care. So this is a great discussion. We can keep going, obviously, for hours on this. We are up against our time. The whole event is a few minutes behind, so I do want to be respectful of the other groups that are coming up. Hopefully the panelists can stick around, and we are going to have a Q&A that is anyone who wants to ask a question, please feel free to pop it into the Q&A, and we'll do that after the next panel for the panelists from both groups. So thank you, Nancy, Brandon, Christian, really appreciate your input.